Starlite is an organization I started up after seeing how difficult it is to bridge the gap between university and employment. Because a degree, I think the motif of today's conversation has been that a degree just isn't enough. You need to really separate yourself. And so I feel like I've had a lot of experiences in doing that, and I have been successful in some regards. So I found that Starlite for me is a way to pass on that knowledge to graduates and even students who are looking to improve their career prospects as well. So for me, it's, I suppose, if we were to break it down to the actual service itself.
Like a lot of the guests and interviewees I have on the podcast, I don't really know personally. So just to begin with, I just wanted to get to know you a bit better. And I find a good way to do that is to sort of focus on those later high school years. They can be, particularly formative for high school students and young people more generally. So if I may, cast your mind back to a couple of years ago. What were you sort of like in those later high school years? Were you someone who was, book smart, academically inclined and the rest of it, or did your interests lie outside the classroom, Ryan?
It's very funny you mentioned that, actually. So a couple of these is quite generous to me, if anything, but I did graduate high school in 2017, so from now about 4 years ago. And so in my later years of high school, we'll say maybe years 10 onwards, because that's when we transitioned to what we called senior school, or where I went to school. I feel that was a big transitionary period for me. I went from a student who I would say I was sort of book smart. I was quite a quiet person. I was very introverted, and so a lot of the time I'd find myself sitting in a library, studying or reading. But I wouldn't say that I was the smartest tool in the shed either. I think the transition came in year 11. It's quite a funny story, actually. So in my school, up till year 10, whenever we got the reports back, we would get A's, B's, and C's. And that's all we would really know, and the mark. Year 11 came around, and they gave you the ranking. And that was a huge eye-opener for me, because I always felt myself to be, an above average student. I'm good at what I do, but not the best at it, if you will. And when this ranking came in, that provided a huge motivation for me to figure out, okay, wow, so is everybody else. And so I think the last term of year 11 and then the whole of year 12, that was where I really decided, okay, well, this is where it counts. Why am I putting all this effort in? Why am I caring if at the end doesn't even matter? This is the 1 year I have to make whatever I can of it. And so towards the end of year 11, start of year 12, that's when things changed a lot. I got a lot more serious about my study. I figured out ways to make myself study more effectively. And I found that overall, I enjoyed year 12 a lot more as a result of that. I definitely became a lot more book smart that way, but I also engaged in lots of extracurriculars as well. I was an avid debater. I loved debating since middle school, since year 8. I did it every Friday. We'd head down to a school to have it around. We'd have debating competitions. It was really fun as well. So that I loved playing soccer, or football, as some people call it as well, in high school too. So I definitely did take an avid interest in those things as well. But yeah, I tried to keep a balance, or tried to keep a balance where I could, I suppose. So definitely a lot more extroverted throughout year 12 as a result of that. But I'd say that I was a late bloomer in that sense.
100%. And just to sort of follow on that, you mentioned that, so you sort of made a transition as you went into year 12, and sort of like a switch flicked, if you like. Did that come with a lot of sort of pressure and sort of like academic pressure at all? Because I know for me, I was someone that experienced a lot of those academic pressures. But were you someone that felt that at all, or did you have a totally different experience?
I definitely think academic pressure played a big role in that too, especially because as a student, or see, as a university student, I can look back and say the ATAR really doesn't mean a lot. But in year 12, it's for some people, it's the hardest thing they've ever been exposed to, right? Working towards a specific ranking, which at least in their eyes decides their future. When in reality, that's not even the case. But there is academic pressure for sure. So I think that was definitely a big push for me to sort of get myself together and figure out what I wanted to do. I think I was always set on doing something either in business or law from I'd say year 10 onwards, because I felt that those were where my skills lied. So for me, I had an advantage because I knew I had some sort of vague goal to work toward, which gave me a bit of an ATAR goal, if you will. But I would say that it definitely was pushed primarily by academic pressure. But I also think it was just me coming to a realization that, there's just no point me, being at school, or me putting in a half-assed effort if at the end of the day
Yeah.
it's not even matter. Everyone tries to reach that top ATAR, the top goal. And in reality, it's not everyone's cup of tea to do so, but I knew, at least for me, that I could give it a best shot and do relatively well. So that's what pushed me forward as well. So I think it was a mix of pressure from the fact that the ATAR counted, but also just from myself saying, you need to do this, and you need to get it done as soon as you can.
Yeah, and speaking of some of the pressures that students face, particularly in those later years of high school, another one of those pressures is obviously figuring out what they want to do after high school, whether it be in tertiary education like yourself, or something else, right? And it gets me thinking of an article you wrote on LinkedIn about the approach students should have to sort of figuring out the interests and passions, and where their career should be. You talked about this interesting sort of mix between being a little bit flexible on the one hand, but also integrating a degree of planning, right? So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that article, and is that sort of an approach you would sort of recommend to students in their later high school years?
100%. So it sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? Be flexible, but also have a plan, right? But I think what the main, I guess, point of that article was to showcase how having a plan is good, because you sort of narrow yourself down to what you feel you'll be good at, right? But in reality, that changes over time, right? It's why, for example, so many people will change uni degrees, because they can't find what they actually want to do. So my advice would be to go into uni, or if you want to do tertiary education, that is, to find what you enjoy. Okay, that's the first thing. So for me, it was a mix of public speaking. I love mathematics, and in high school, economics was my favorite subject. As you can imagine, finance and economics sort of lied within the realms of what I felt I was good at. And so far, I really enjoyed doing what I do. But for me, in that degree alone, there's heaps of different careers that you could potentially be exposed to: investment management, perhaps the finance side, accountancy. I currently work in assurance as well, right? You have things like full-on economics. You can be a consultant, right? You can go into management. There's so many different areas that you can go into. So having a plan is good, because it gives you that rough mold to work in, but you can never really be set on one specific career most of the time. Of course, there are a few exceptions to that. If you're doing medicine and you specialize in something, you're probably going to end up in that field somewhere. But I think the majority of people who go into, let's say, law, arts, or business, or even for some STEM, I guess, degrees as well, for them, there needs to be a degree of flexibility, needs to be a degree of adaptability as well, because you can't be set on a specific thing. And when you go into uni, you'll start seeing that as well, right? Where you have an idea of what something is like, and you'll realize, oh, this isn't meant for me. Or actually, you know what? I didn't think I'd like that, but all of a sudden I'm, sort of veering towards it. And that happens so often. I can guarantee you can ask any of my peers, even my friends as well, and they'll say that uni definitely changed their perspective on a lot of things they felt they wanted to do and what they initially wanted to do. And how that's all changed.
Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point there, and it got me thinking of our earlier conversation a couple of weeks back. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you sort of talked about it's a bit unrealistic to sort of have one job. As a student, it's a bit unrealistic to think that you'll be in the same job for the whole of your career, right? Could you speak on that and sort of where that idea comes from?
Definitely. I'll throw back to an anecdote here. I have a few people who I look up to in terms of career and such, and I was having a chat with one of them quite a while back, and I had the question. I said, if I'm starting out somewhere, do I stay or do I move around? If I move around, for example, does that cut my ability to excel, or does it maybe act as a restart point? Am I losing time? And they gave me a very interesting answer. They said that up till about at least this is mainly for business or economics or finance students in particular, but up till about the age of 27, you have the ability to move around different jobs to see what you like to do. And you won't lose a lot of that time factor that exists, right? A lot of students will think, okay, if I start as a graduate, and I spend, let's say, 5 or 6 years, I'll do really well. I'm really good at that. And fair enough, you might be, but your skill set is stuck in that specific area. And moving around after that is extremely difficult to do. I say it's unrealistic in that I encourage people to move around and mold and, get new experiences, find what they like. I think, especially in competitive job markets like law or business, you need to be open to opportunity. You need to be open to, taking on new challenges, because that's how you grow in this specific kind of job market as well, right? Where people aren't necessarily looking so much for technical skills as much as they are for creativity, flexibility, and adaptability as well, right? If you're someone who, reacts easily to change, someone who is open for new challenges, someone who seeks their own opportunities, you will find yourself way above the rest because you have something which you can't automate. You have something which isn't a technical skill, right? You've got something which will continuously let you grow in any field that you move into, right? It's why so many successful people almost never, usually don't start or don't end up in the career field that they actually started in, because they've gained experiences, they've seen what they liked, and they've built something out of that as well. So whilst you could, if you're in a career path, as I mentioned before, that is quite standard, that's fair enough, right? Of course, flexibility is still good, but it's not a necessity to do well. I think in any business or law-esque kind of degree or any kind of career path you're looking into, flexibility is something which you will always need, because it's those who have it that are often more suited to things like managerial positions or are able to excel further in wherever they're working to.
Yeah. And it's interesting how we can sort of contrast the sort of more traditional professions in business and law, as you mentioned, with the space of entrepreneurship, which is, subject to a crazy amount of flexibility and change constantly, right?
100%.
And I definitely want to, get an insight into your approach to entrepreneurship, particularly with Starlite. But before we get there, Ryan, so obviously after you graduated from high school, you went to Macquarie University. And as you mentioned, you studied economics and applied finance. So, I mean, just straight off the bat, what was your experience like at university? I'll leave it at that.
Sure. I mean, do you want me to say in my first year or up till where I am now, or?
Yeah, I mean, particularly early on, did you find it initially challenging having a lot of independence, or were you someone that thrived in that sort of environment?
I think it's a different change for everyone individually, right? From my own experience, going to uni was a completely different setup. And I realized in high school how honestly spoon-fed we are. If you think about at least the HSC, right, in New South Wales, right, you're given an exam format, which is going to look like this, this, and this. You have an idea of what questions are going to be asked. You've got a barrage of different papers to look at. You've got course content across the internet. You've got textbooks. You've got teachers who are with you throughout the whole year. It's very easy to thrive in that kind of environment because you have a lot of support systems that you maybe don't really see that you have until you leave them. At uni, it's a completely different experience. And for me, whilst I say it was a challenge, it was extremely fun, but it taught me the importance of understanding how I work and the importance of, again, being flexible to change and adapt in a specific environment as well. For me, uni was like doing the HSC every 6 months, right? Because you have to work towards an exam every semester. Often you'll have one lecture, one tutorial a week. And one thing that I did find is that whilst you might not be at uni doing uni work, whether it's going to classes or lectures as much, the amount of stuff you have to learn does not change. And I think it's a sentiment that a lot of people can maybe resonate with as well. When you're in your first year of uni, it's either really challenging or really easy, right? In your second year, no matter what discipline you're in, it's always challenging, right? Because the first year is where you're learning the foundations of your degree, or learning the foundations of, what you're going to learn for the next 3 to 5 or 6 years, depending on how long your degree is. I'll give you the best example. First year economics at university was primarily understanding what we did in year 12 economics with a little bit of added stuff. So for me, I didn't find it a challenge to learn. Second year came around and I was like, whoa, this is a huge step up. And for me, that was where the steep learning curve hit as well. So my advice, I suppose, that stems from this is don't take it lightly, because I did, right? I felt first year, I was like, uni, I can do this. This is so easy. And second year came and I was like, crap, this is what I imagined uni would have been like, right, in my first year. So I would say the first 2 years definitely were the biggest eye openers for me. Then third year came around and it was like, okay, I'm getting towards the latter end of my degree. I'm starting to understand the key concepts a lot more. The foundations are all cemented quite easily. But then COVID
Yeah.
hit. So that then created a new, I guess, space of online learning. And again, flexibility played a big part in this too, being able to adapt to being at home and learning online, right? Doing things like Excel classes online, learning coding languages online. It was a very big difference from being, at uni and then being back at home and learning. But I think that taught me the importance of persistence and resilience as well, right? It's never easy to learn online. It's never easy to have that same uni experience when you're not physically at uni as well.
100%.
So yeah, so it's been a challenge, but it's definitely been one that's let me and helped me grow and develop key skills and understand
Yeah.
the importance of having those soft skills and having that mindset to be adaptive to certain changes.
100%. And one interesting thing you mentioned there was that steep learning curve that students face between the first year and second year. And I sort of wanted to drill down on your degree and discipline in more detail. So you studied the economics and applied finance, as you mentioned, and again in a LinkedIn post. Sorry, again, I'll refer to that probably 100 times by the end of this interview.
Completely
fine. You talked about some of the resources. Well, firstly, you talked about the importance of learning technical skills, right? And developing a technical proficiency, particularly for students studying economics and applied finance.
Yes.
And of particular interest, you noted a few resources that really helped you develop those skills. So Ryan, I was wondering if you could talk about, that approach and some of those resources that you found really helpful in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. So as much as I did mention the technical skills maybe aren't as important as your soft skills are, they definitely do play a massive role in making your job and initial career a lot easier to get into, because there needs to be a good mix of both. But I think if you had to choose one, I would still choose soft skills. But in terms of technical skills, the ones that I really see, especially for economics and finance, you need to have a good level of understanding of your basic Microsoft Office suite. So Excel is a really big one of that. Even things like coding languages. So you've got Python, you've got C++ as well. There's a software that some people might have heard called R as well, which I think is really important, especially for people who want to go into econometrics, right? That stems to their economics degree as well. And so these are the kind of ones that I've identified by looking and seeing, what our tutors and lecturers use while teaching us stuff at uni, but also what I've heard, from people in the industry as well, or even students who are just really interested in this kind of stuff. In terms of resources, for me, honestly, it's a bit of a boring answer, but I learned a lot of mine off YouTube. There's so many free courses that are of such high quality that you can just watch and follow through by experts in the field. And it really does help improve your skill in a specific area, right? I would still say if you want more of a professional course, some universities do offer these classes as well, or as a side thing, they might offer like a mini course to do as well. I know with Macquarie Uni, they do give us a free subscription to LinkedIn Learning, which has a lot of the same courses which you can do, not just in technical skills, like how to hold a conversation, how to be a leader, etc. How to start your own business, all the way to things like how to read a profit and loss statement. There's so many things you can learn there too. So I would encourage you, if you're in uni or in high school, to see if your institution or school offers that, because it's a really good resource to have. Otherwise, you can look at things like Udemy, Skillshare, Brilliant. All of these places also offer similar courses too. But I would definitely say that if you just want to look on YouTube, for example, you can find a bunch of these courses to have a look at, and it really is a good thing to do. If you're in your holidays, let's say you've got, if you're not UNSW, because I'm aware that your holidays are a little bit chopped up there comparative to other places. But with me, for example, we get usually a month and a half off in the middle of the year. In that middle of the year, if I wasn't working, I'd be, learning the basics of maybe Python, or, improving my ability to look at Tableau or SQL or something like that, because I know that the career that I want to go into, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of analytics involved. And to be able to understand that gives me an edge over people who are also applying for similar positions later on.
100%. And yeah, it's all about sort of distinguishing yourself from the crowd, right? If you think about it,
of course,
if you think about the amount of graduates who are studying economics or applied finance across not just Sydney, but Australia, right, is thousands, right? So you somehow have to just distinguish yourself from the crowd. So that's a good 100%. Point that you made there. Just to sort of wrap up on the university part of your journey so far, You mentioned a couple of the challenges and some of the traps that students fall into, particularly in their first year. But just to sort of hammer that point home, were there any other sort of challenges that you faced during your university degree, or you think a lot of other students face? Are there any sort of pitfalls or hurdles that you had to overcome in that respect?
I think for me, one of the biggest hurdles, unfortunately, has stemmed from COVID. It's staying motivated to be on top of my study.
Yeah.
So often in uni, you can get really caught up in uni life, whether it's enjoying with friends or taking part in societies, finding work. And a lot of people will often favor those over uni, right? There are some who have a good balance, and fair play to them. But for myself, I did find that for the first couple of years at uni, uni was not the biggest priority for me. It was getting experience. It was getting out there. It was trying new things and seeing what I enjoyed. And don't get me wrong, that is equally as important, but you need to also make sure you have a good balance of your study as well. Because often I'd find myself, having to cram in a bunch of study towards the end, and it's never fun to do that. So having a good balance and being able to, keep on top of everything as each week comes along. That's my biggest piece of advice, and take it seriously from day one. At the end of the day, it's an undergraduate course. It does shape up where you will end up most of the time as well. So the more effort you put into it, the more you get out, right, at the end of the day. So I would definitely advise people to make sure that they stay on top of their work. But I think also, that just came to my mind now, another pitfall is also starting a degree which you're not happy with, right? If you are not happy with a degree, there is nothing wrong with changing it to do something else. But a big pitfall students might face is actually staying in a degree for too long and thinking, you know what, I don't like this, and then changing maybe 2 to 2.5 years down the track. Unfortunately, with uni, and especially if you want to start your career early, time is definitely of the essence. So I would encourage people to look quite carefully and look at the details of what they're going to learn, what kind of career paths stem from the stuff that they're going to be doing, the sort of work they'll be doing, the kind of skills they should be developing over the course of their degree as well, and make a pretty informed decision. For example, right, a law degree sounds fantastic, but I've known plenty of people who've done law with something else, not to become lawyers just because having a law degree sounds pretty cool. Right? Of course, if you want to go into a legal path, or you see yourself, maybe going into government policy or something like that, fair enough, having a legal backing is great. But for people who want to, for example, go into investment banking, a law degree is not very necessary for that, right? You'd rather learn hardcore finance skills and hone in on that instead. So I would encourage people to not think, oh, well, this degree is really good, or look, this degree historically has been very sustainable and very stable, because that stuff, it doesn't matter, right? What you're good at, and what you're good at is what you're going to want to do for the rest of your life. So I encourage students to make sure that they make that informed decision. And I think one thing which will stem from that as well is that, if you're doing something you enjoy and you've made that informed decision, you won't find it a chore to stay on top of your work, because you have that motivation and a desire to learn more about it as well.
100%. I think those are some really good points you bring up there, actually. I do see, people, especially young people, can sort of get caught up with the status and prestige of a degree, which I think is what you were touching on. And I think cutting through that and seeing the potential career options, for example, is a good way to sort of negate that, because it's very easy to get caught up in that sort of hype, I suppose. So Ryan, I wanted to sort of change paces a little bit and talk about your passion for entrepreneurship and startups. Obviously, that's something that you're really big on. So just to begin with, I just wanted to get an insight into your own experience. At high school and university, was entrepreneurship opportunities readily available to you? Were they pushed towards you, or were they quite scarce in your experience?
I'd say in high school, I wasn't very entrepreneurial, mainly because I had no exposure to it, if I'm being completely honest. For me, coming from a family who've always worked in either big business, or they haven't really ventured into their own thing as a standard job. For me, it was always, okay, well, work in a big company and you'll do fine. Uni has obviously changed that perspective of mine quite a bit. And I think at a young age as well, sort of a university age, it's one of the best things that you can do. And I saw this by looking at what others were doing. People who were getting into, BCG as consultants, people who were getting into Goldman as investment bankers, right? Just out of uni. A lot of the things that they did were starting up their own organizations. And it's because it teaches you everything about running a business, right? Which you can't learn anywhere else unless you have firsthand experience doing so. And I think it's something for me which has helped me differentiate myself too, whilst exercising my passion through an organization. So for me, it really stemmed from understanding that in uni, especially in my discipline, you need to differentiate yourself. You need to stand out from the crowd. And one way to do that is by starting something of your own and having that project and seeing where it takes you as well. Right? And not only that, but worst come to worst, I mean, not worst come to worst, but it is something that you can continue working on in the future as well.
Yeah.
Right? It's always something which you'll have as some sort of passive income stream as well, which is fantastic. So for me, there were lots of benefits to do it. I think the hardest part of starting it, at least, has been just maintaining it throughout COVID and sticking true to the mission that you're trying to bring forward.
100%. And just on that point, do you think, for students out there, are the benefits of entrepreneurship, are they limited just to the X's and O's of, starting your own business? Or are there sort of broader, lessons and values that can be, learned through that process of creating a project or a passion project or whatever it is?
Oh, 100%. I can speak from experience here. You learn to be a lot more disciplined with the way that you do things as well. And you learn to stay grounded, which is really important, right? I think a lot of people, when they start university, and myself included, wanted to do a little bit of everything. When in reality, what's more beneficial is doing a few things, but being really, really good at them, right? You want to make sure that you have your roots cemented in things which you're going to take on your career forward. So, of course, the X's and O's do exist of starting a business, and they always will. But regardless of whether it's successful or if it fails, it is a personal lesson which you do learn, right? A very, very famous quote, I'm sure everyone has heard it before, is failure is the first step to success, right? Because it teaches you, where you went wrong, so for next time how to improve it. And now, even in massive companies, entrepreneurship is being brought in again, right? In the form of innovation. How do we improve the way we do things? No matter what level you are, that idea and that skill of innovation and creativity is something which, if any graduate or any student possesses, that is a huge thing for them as well. And I think starting your own organization, having that freedom to choose how you want to run it and what you want to do, that helps build that skill a lot. And I found myself, going into job interviews and such, and that being a talking point between me and the interviewer, because it is something which they've seen value in, as have I. So I think that might be, I guess, a tangible example of where that creativity and innovation, that skill's been developed and actually been beneficial in, I guess, accelerating my position comparative to other competitors in that same job market as well.
Yeah, 100% actually. And it's funny you mentioned that. It's a good talking point in interviews because, I find it the similar sort of sentiment in my own context, because it shows initiative, I think. Because at the end of the day, when you're starting something like this and something like Starlite, which we'll get into, there's no one to tell you what to do. There's no one even to tell you to start or where to start, right? So a lot of it has to do with being proactive. Do you sort of agree with that sort of approach?
100%. It's the biggest benefit, but also the biggest challenge, because you have complete control, but it's how you manage that to make it successful. That's where that contention point is. But again, as I mentioned, it is an extremely beneficial thing to do, to have that responsibility. And if it is successful, you can now say, well, I've built something of my own with no internal help. It's just been on my own accord. And that is something which, again, as I said, no business class, no entrepreneurship class, no conversation can teach you. You have to be there to experience it firsthand. That's how you take away those lessons on the biggest scale possible.
So we've mentioned Starlite a few times already. So let's talk about Starlite. For those that aren't aware of what it is, can you give our listeners an idea of what Starlite is and how it benefits its consumers, students?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So Starlite is an organization I started up after seeing how difficult it is to bridge the gap between university and employment. Because a degree, I think the motif of today's conversation has been that a degree just isn't enough. You need to really separate yourself. And so I feel like I've had a lot of experiences in doing that, and they have been successful in some regard. So I found that Starlite for me is a way to pass on that knowledge to graduates and even students who are looking to improve their career prospects as well. So for me, it's, I suppose, if we were to break it down to the actual service itself, it is a mentoring service where I help a few students really think about how they want to get into the careers they want to, and then guiding them in the direction to do so by telling them good ways to do it, how to tackle interviews, how to tackle assessment centers, etc. So it's sort of providing this holistic service where I can help students, guide their way into their specific career choice.
Yeah. So actually, I just thought of again another LinkedIn post you talked you wrote, and in that post you talked about sort of you started Starlite when you only had two skills or two relevant skills, right? One of which being public speaking and the other being online graphic design. So did you find that starting Starlite you had to learn things along the way? Was that a challenging process for you?
Definitely. So I think it might be good to give you a bit of context. So when I started Starlite, actually, it wasn't what it is now. I started it about almost 3.5 years ago. And it actually started out as just a networking platform where I would host a couple of events here and there and get students to come and join. And realistically for that, I needed to be good at speaking to make sure I could get people to come and facilitate that networking or panel event. And online design was good just so I could market the event. Those are the two skills I had. And I was like, you know what, I can give this a shot. But through that, I think I started to realize that there is more to this than just being a platform or being a meeting place for people in industry and those who are keen to get into that industry as well. In fact, what rather exists is this gap in the market where you have a bunch of students who want to do really well, but don't know how to get there. They have the caliber, but aren't being pushed up high enough to see where they could really stand. And so that's when I decided, you know what, I think it's time I change this around. And of course, as we'll touch upon a bit later, being a mentor at Art of Smart and I suppose being a tutor as well has helped me build those skills where I am confident enough to say, hey, give me your hand. I can help you get where you want to be as well. So, and I think also what's also helped is, of course, being in uni and that just whole time horizon of it. Over the years, I've just learned more and more about the challenges and also, I guess, the ways to really get more people involved in doing their thing. And what I'm thinking is that in the future, I'd like to improve the I guess the scale of the way I do things and even branch out into helping students start their own organizations and such, because I see that as being valuable to them at the end of the day.
So I just wanted to get your opinion. Like, is there currently, do you think students have that problem of being unable to bridge that gap between their degree and the full-time employment? Is that like a problem that exists in the market, and is that an issue that you see a lot of students face?
100%. Of course, you have extremely high caliber students who make it through quite easily, but a lot of people who do get full-time employment, let's say, assuming maybe they're not in that sort of high caliber sector, a lot of them will get it through things like networking, right? Knowing people in industry and skipping that process because they've built those meaningful connections. But, I read a stat the other day, I think it was on average uni student, this was a global stat, but I think it does still stem in Australia as well. On average, a graduate has to wait about just over a year and 2 to 3 months for full-time employment. So you have people, again, who I think they've got degrees, that they're obviously quite able, if you will, to learn and to work, but it's about getting that chance and opportunity and standing out, right? That does make that gap a bit higher, if you will, or a bit larger. And I also think that a lot of people, and this is the unfortunate thing, so they have caliber, but in a 20 to 30 minute interview, maybe they might be a bit nervous or something, and before you know it, it's a make or break. So it's about building up that confidence in students and saying, you know what, you've got these skills, you can do this. It's about understanding that and giving them that confidence to then, push them forward and say, you can do this now, give it a shot, right? 100%. And I think the more that you're mentored, the more that you start your own things, the more involved you get with societies and even with organizations, right? I volunteer a lot as well. That has helped me improve my confidence because I know that I've done all of these on my own accord. So when I go into an interview, I very well know what I want to talk about. I feel confident that I've done enough to really be suitable for the role I'm applying for. And that's a huge thing. And part of, I guess, the work that I do at Starlite is getting people more involved with things that give them skills that will be beneficial to a career path that they would like to get into.
And you mentioned there, your interest and passion for mentorship, not only at Starlite, but also at Art of Smart Education. So, I suppose on a general point, is mentoring, something that you really enjoy? And what are some of the sort of key lessons the key values and principles that you try to instill in your students in your capacity as a mentor?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I love mentoring. I love doing it, and I don't think I'd ever stop doing it, provided that I still can. For me, it's always been something extremely valuable to see somebody else grow and be a helping hand on that way. So I don't see it as much of a job or a chore or even like a position as much as I do as just my passion more than anything else. So for me, it's always something I've wanted to do, and I'll continue to do it. Some key principles and values. I think it's a bit difficult to answer this from a general perspective because it really does depend on the individual you're working with.
Right.
But I think what I would like them to have towards the end are obviously confidence in themselves, right? Because that's the biggest thing. If they're confident, they'll be able to exhibit that confidence, and that does create a much better impression, right? I also think, ensuring that they are flexible and adaptable to certain things too. So I guess showing them how being adaptive to certain situations is actually a very beneficial thing overall. I think a third principle too is to stay, I suppose, open to opportunity. Not to get stuck in one specific role and say, you know what, this is it. Because I feel that the more opportunities you get, the more that you do with yourself, the more of a well-rounded person you become. And you've got a lot of time after you graduate to do this, right? It's especially in business, law, or arts disciplines. There's a lot of movement you can make. So I think those are probably three key principles I have, but there's so many more that would be quite bespoke to the individual I'm working with.
100%. And I think that's really valuable, particularly for young students out there, particularly who are trying to, as you said, bridge that gap between their university degrees and full-time employment. And that's something that I am experiencing right now with a few weeks left in my degree. And
wow,
I'm going to tell you, man, it's tough to land that full-time job. It's been a long process for me, and it's still ongoing. So I think the stats you brought up there are definitely relevant for me, and I'm sure a lot of other students out there can definitely resonate with that as well.
Definitely.
So
I think, sorry, just one more point on that too. And of course, I wish you all the best for that as well. And I'm sure you'll be fine. But I think another thing, and this is something which I was thinking about the other day, was that traditionally, if you were to maybe step back 20 to 30 years ago, a law degree or a business degree, that was seen as very robust, very secure. There was stability in that career. But it was because that was where the job market was pertaining towards. With entrepreneurship now playing a much bigger role in this push for creativity and innovation, and I suppose even tech as being an industry which is definitely booming a lot more, not just in Australia but across the world. I feel that historical backing needs to shift away from law degrees, away from business, and in towards things which are the future of the economy as well, right? I'll give you the best example. If you went to, so my dad's an accountant, much like I guess currently am at PWC, right? Even though I don't have accounting knowledge, but 20 years ago, what is now automated for me was done by someone. So in 20 years, you've seen this sort of shift away from traditional ways of working to now working with technology to achieve the same outcome, right? Obviously on a much larger scale. And I guarantee you in the next 5 to 10 years, what I'm doing now will probably be automated as well. And so I think there needs to be a push for students to, if they want to go into law, they want to go into business, by all means do it. But you need to get those technical skills or do some sort of technical degree on the side as well if you are looking to, branch out into something new or venture into something new as well, because that is the way of the future. And so I think that stat, that 1.5 year stat that I mentioned resonates. A lot of students who have entered into traditionally secure markets that are now, unfortunately, because of that historical backing, extremely oversupplied.
100%. Ryan, I wanted to again pivot sort of on the point of mentorship. I wanted to talk about your experience at Art of Smart Education, particularly. So you've had a few roles with the business, whether they be student-facing roles as a tutor, or sort of the back-end sort of roles as an innovation director or resource designer. So, and actually, it gets me thinking back to our earlier conversation. You talked about the CEO Rowan, and he's quite an influential person to you. So, can you talk about your time at Art of Smart? What has that experience been like for you?
Fantastic. As you mentioned, I've done a lot of different things at Art of Smart, venturing from things like HR to resource design to business development to obviously the core of tutoring and mentoring. And that's been a big push, I think in my, I suppose my drive to go into entrepreneurship, working at a small firm, right? That was a startup, sort of 9-10 years ago. So it's been a very eye-opening for me, working with a lot of students from different backgrounds, working through their own individual problems and obstacles, turning those into challenges and then overcoming those challenges and seeing students grow. For me, I think that's what really instilled this passion to help, right? Students who I know have a really high caliber, but don't have the tools to ensure that they unlock it, if that makes sense. And so working at Art of Smart for me has been an extremely rewarding time. And it's a reason why I've stayed there throughout my whole degree, despite, working at PWC or running my own business. I've found that to be an extremely consistent thing I've done, because for me, it's more than just a job. For me, it's a mission, it's a passion. And look, as I mentioned, I've been lucky to do so many things there. That's how I built up my skills in resource design. From HR, I got to learn from an interviewer's perspective what they're trying to look for. And that really helps in understanding, okay, well, how do you be that ideal candidate? How do you, I suppose, impress in that regard? And how do you add value to a business as well by having specific, sets of skills as well? So for me, it's been extremely rewarding, and I wouldn't have changed it for anything else, because I feel like that's been a big push for me into venturing into PwC or venturing into my own thing. It's already stemmed from learning those soft skills of presentation and just learning really how to work with people. That's what's really pushed me forward.
100%. And from the outside looking in, Art of Smart sort of has a newer, innovative approach to education. It's not just about the conventional role of a tutor, right? It's, from the outside looking in, I could be totally wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about taking a more involved approach to students' learning experience and education.
Absolutely. Definitely. No, it definitely does aim to provide that holistic aspect of tutoring and mentoring to a student to really bring out the best in them.
And I bring up that point to ask another question about sort of the distinction between that conventional role of just a tutor, teaching the X's and O's of biology, chemistry, English, and the role of a mentor. Obviously, you've served in both capacities. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that distinction and I suppose the importance of that distinction.
Definitely. I think as a tutor, you do have elements of mentoring that do exist. But if we were to separate those two and isolate them as two different things, I think tutoring is very much focused on producing that academic outcome, right? Getting that high mark, getting that ATAR, just sort of teaching content and revising content. But often it's not really the issue that students are facing, right? Because I honestly feel that any student can learn, but what the biggest struggle is not so much their ability to learn, but rather their ability to want to learn, if that makes sense. So that's where the mentoring sets in, right? Or even how to learn. They can learn, but don't have the tools on how to do so. So that's where the mentoring steps in, as a way to say, content aside, here's how you can actually work to be more efficient in your classroom, or here's how you can, manage your time at home to make sure that you're staying on top of your work. And inadvertently, that starts to bridge gaps between students' knowledge and the way that they work. And so that's why I honestly feel that when you are a tutor, you have certain elements of mentoring, but I think as a mentor, you're specifically focused outside of like that academic or numeric outcome, and rather helping build up the individual from a personal sense, helping them create solid foundations for study, helping them create solid foundations for organization, which maybe study, of course, might end at the end of your, I guess, educational career, right? Whether it's at uni or doing a postgraduate qualification, but things like organization, time management, speaking, critical thinking, these things are so applicable till the end of your career, right? Just before you retire, and even post as well. And so I think whilst tutoring is important, up till maybe the point of year 12, or if you do university tutoring, up till the end of university, it's the mentoring aspect that I think stays with the student longer. And I think that's why it's good to have a mix of both to create that holistic experience. But I would say that a mentor is definitely more focused on longer term outcomes as a general isolated role.
Yeah, I think that answers my question very comprehensively. Ryan, in the interest of time, I wanted to switch paces again to your time at PwC. So you work part-time at Art of Smart, which you've held on to despite doing all these different things. And you also work part-time at PwC as an undergraduate associate. And I think
Correct.
on our earlier conversation, I didn't know what an undergraduate associate was. So to start off with, for those that might not know what that role is, what can you tell us about being an undergraduate associate at PWC?
Definitely. Think of it as like a cadet, which is what is often known in the business term as someone who's been taken under a business's wing, trained them up for a specific position.
Right.
So essentially, I work as like an intern on a bunch of different clients in the audit and assurance part of the business. And so my role would be to, look through the financials of listed clients and just essentially perform accounting procedures on that as well. The reason why the term undergraduate is important there is because it is while I'm in my final year of university
Right.
as well. So for reference, I started off as a vacationer over the last summer, and then I decided to continue working with them part-time because I enjoyed the role, and I think it did provide me with a lot of insight into the corporate experience, which I think is very important for any business-esque student. So I'm like, I suppose, a graduate or an intern, but I'm yet to finish off my study.
Right. And I wanted to explore your experience, working at obviously one of the big four, right? Obviously, that can be a bit maybe intimidating for some students. I've never worked at a big four, so I'm just speculating. But do you think that, well, firstly, did you have that experience? And do you think other students, in their undergraduate degrees, experience that? Or what's your sort of take on that?
I think I don't actually think there's a lot of fear, I think, of joining a big four. Of course, you are aware that you are joining a very large company. And so maybe, you need to maybe work a bit harder, maybe extra hours here and there. But I think what's so attractive about working at a big four is the fact that at a young age, you're exposed to a large network of different professions and different individuals, different businesses, etc., which I think at a young age is definitely a much better trade-off as well. But I would say that, a lot of my friends, whether it's accounting, business, finance, economics, all of them, have applied for big four or big three consultancies or bank positions as well, because I think that's what is extremely, I suppose, attractive to a graduate, to a student. I also feel to an extent that these firms continuously set the standard for the industry. They're always innovating. And so if you're part of that business, you're sort of part of that driving force of change, which I think to me is definitely a very attractive thing for many students across the board.
Yeah, and you mentioned you started back in the summer. It was December, right? When you started. And you've since worked there part-time. So it's been almost a year. So I just wanted to get an insight, and for our listeners to get an insight into some of the things that really helped you succeed in that role. Was there a particular approach or mindset that you had that helped you be successful? You've already mentioned the opportunities of networking. Was there anything else along the similar line?
Definitely. Look, as an intern or as a graduate, you're not expected to have a lot of industry acumen because you're out of uni, and of course you're expected to be willing to learn, if anything, and be proactive about that. But ideally, I think the mindset that most of the interns had, along with myself as well, was to just be inquisitive and ensure that we make the most out of it and really put our best effort in where we could. And so of course, even up till now, I'm mindful of the fact that I've got less than a year's experience in accounting, and I'm not from an accounting background by education either. So for me, the learning curve has been very steep. And the best thing, I suppose, about working at a big four is that the culture is such that they're very facilitative of that, and they're very understanding of that, and don't expect it, but they are there to help you along that journey as well. So I would suggest, and I guess a few things that I've learned about working in a big four, and I guess a piece of advice I would give is to be very inquisitive. If you do end up, at a vacation or at a grad, be inquisitive, ask questions, understand that you're not expected to know a lot. And so, of course, if you are inquisitive and you are asking questions and you are actively involved with the work you're doing, that's where it all starts, right? Again, like I think that mindset just needs to be there, where you're trying to put your best effort in. The work might not be, extremely exciting compared to what you thought it was, but it's still about pushing through and trying to understand the fundamentals of what you're doing. And I think a lot of people, myself included, who maybe aren't from accounting backgrounds, for example, let's just take auditing maybe as an example of that. It definitely became a lot more enjoyable for me once I understood the point of what I was doing. right? And
Right.
that took, a few months to learn, actually, okay, well, why are we looking at this specific activity? Why are we doing this specific task? The continuous asking of whys eventually created this picture for me where I was like, you know what, from like an end-to-end process, I can actually talk about what we do. And that made
Yeah.
it, and when that clicked, I was like, wow, like this actually makes a lot more sense. And you start to piece together small things. And I also think that at any big four, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, that same learning curve will exist. So it's about being proactive about it and just trying to actually understand, okay, well, what are we trying to do here? And the moment you let that settle in, that's when it becomes a lot more fun as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think that approach can be applied to any sort of industry that or discipline a student is looking to go into.
Definitely.
And yeah, you brought up a really, really good point there about, particularly as an intern, as an entry level graduate potentially, you're working on like the very, very micro part of the business, right? And it's often you often get detached from the end product. And I think working at a family law practice, I've definitely dealt with a similar sentiment where you're working on such a small part where you don't understand the significance and meaning of what you're doing, which is what you mentioned there.
100%. Look, I do think that as I've progressed along, I've definitely been handed a bit more responsibility, because obviously your team will see that you're starting to become a lot more confident with the things you're doing. But 100%, again, at an intern level, there's no expectation. But I think what also comes with that is maybe not extreme responsibilities. It's more about building you up slowly. So I can definitely resonate with that as well. But I think, again, if you put your best effort forward, you can accelerate that process to become part of that bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you've definitely applied throughout your university, high school experience, all the way through to the early stages of your given profession as well. So Ryan,
Definitely.
the time has flown by. So in the interest of time, I wanted to touch on one final point, if I may.
Of course.
You've talked a lot in this interview about your role as a mentor, right? Whether it be at Art of Smart or with Starlite. And it's obviously, something that you're really, really passionate about, particularly helping students navigate their own personal and professional development. And as you put it in your own words, equipping them with the skills and resources to bridge that gap between the university degree and full-time employment. So I just wanted to raise a final question to you. What advice might you give to a student who, might be trying to bridge that gap, who might be in their early university degree years? What advice might you give to that person, who's trying to figure out, where their passions and interests lie? You might have mentioned it already, but just a final opportunity to hear your thoughts in that respect.
Absolutely. It's a very open-ended question, right? I think, again, it comes down to each individual. But if I were to give a few key pointers and what I've seen as work, not just for myself, but my peers as well, it's really about finding, I think, three things. The first being, what you actually enjoy.
Right.
The second being what you're good at. And the third being what you want to do, right? And they all do, I guess, overlap each other a little bit. To find out what you enjoy, take part in extracurriculars that sound fun to you, right? Really get yourself out there and actually, dip your toes into different, I suppose, pools of things to find out what you really enjoy. Once you've found out what you enjoy, I would suggest then figuring out, okay, well, what skills do I have from this enjoyment, right? What can I actually apply to further, I guess, my ability to do well in this specific area? Once that's done, you'll be able to have a nexus there. And that nexus will tell you, okay, well, I've got these skills. I enjoy doing this. Here's what I want to do, right? It's really about understanding yourself and understanding where you want to end up, right? And often you'll think about what you're good at and you think about the skills that you have. I would definitely say, regardless, if you're still not too sure, to just get involved as much as you can at uni, right? Whether it's volunteering for different societies, whether it's volunteering outside of uni, whether it's, networking with individuals in the industry that you think might be cool to start in. I wish someone had explained this to me earlier, but your career, it's not meant to be stock standard. It's not meant to be one specific line of progression all the way from graduate to, partner or CEO or whatever. There is a lot of different roads and different pathways you can take that would take you to different places, different careers, different jobs, etc. And so at the age of 21, 22, 23, whenever you graduate, you still got a good 3 to 4 years before you really need to be cementing your career at that point. But there's still opportunity to move even at that sense as well. So I encourage you or I encourage students to really take that advice on board and just do as much as they can, right? Of course, while staying on top of their study. That's still a big priority. But I would definitely say that it's completely fine to try something which is out of your discipline, out of your comfort zone, because if you like it, you can develop skills in that as well. And that makes you a very well-rounded individual, which is what businesses, just what companies, just what people who are hiring you, they want to see. They want to see someone who's, had experience at lots of things. And that does show that you are able to venture out into things that are outside of your comfort zone as well.
Yeah. And I think that perfectly, to be honest, I think that perfectly sums up the sort of theme and the vibe of the conversation, to be honest. And
Of course.
What you're sort of touching on is that, it's an opportune time for students to get involved in as much things as possible, because it's a really low risk environment, right? And I think that's what a lot of people on this show have talked about. You don't really have much to lose as a student, right? Obviously,
Exactly.
that's a broad generalization, doesn't apply to everyone, but as a general principle, you don't have that much to lose relative to where you might be 5, 10, 15 years down the line, right?
Of
So
course.
I think that's a really valuable lesson for students to have. And a lot of the things that you've mentioned throughout the podcast, you reflect, on Starlite, on LinkedIn, and also on your own personal page as well. So you write a lot of interesting articles and posts on LinkedIn, and I'll definitely I definitely encourage students who are listening to this, to really have a look at that as well. Ryan, as I mentioned, we are pretty much out of time. So on that note, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time. It is a Saturday afternoon. I feel like I say this at the end of every interview, but I'm sure you have better things to do. But
No, this has been a fantastic experience. I think it's good what you're doing, and I'm really happy that I could have been part of it. So I appreciate you reaching out to me and bringing me on this show, because I do hope that some students can gain some valuable lessons from it.